Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today, we're diving into one of the most influential economic revolutions of the modern world, the Keynesian revolution. Now, I know, economics might not seem like the most thrilling topic, but trust me, this one changed the course of history. So, picture this, the year is 1929. The stock market has just crashed, unemployment is soaring, and people are struggling to make ends meet. For decades, classical economists believed the market could regulate itself, just let supply and demand do their thing, and everything would work out. But when the Great Depression hit, that theory started to fall apart. The economy wasn't bouncing back on its own. People were desperate for a solution. Enter John Maynard Keynes, an economist with a radical new idea. What if the government could step in to boost the economy? What if, instead of waiting for things to fix themselves, we used public spending to create jobs and stimulate demand? This idea didn't just challenge old-school economic thought, it completely transformed how governments handled financial crises. Over the next few decades, Keynesianism shaped major policies, from the New Deal to modern-day stimulus measures. Even now, whenever there's an economic downturn, you'll hear debates about whether we should spend our way out of it. That's Keynes' legacy in action. In this video, we'll break down exactly how Keynesian economics works, why it became so influential, and the major debates surrounding it. By the end, you'll see why Keynes is still one of the most talked about economists in history. Let's get started. Alright, let's rewind to the moment that set everything in motion, the Great Depression. In 1929, the stock market crashed hard. Billions of dollars in wealth vanished practically overnight, and with it, businesses collapsed, banks failed, and people lost their jobs by the millions. By 1933, unemployment in the United States had skyrocketed to a staggering 25%. 1 out of every 4 workers was jobless. Families lost their homes, people lined up for bread, and the economy was in complete free fall. Now, classical economists at the time stuck to their guns. They believed in laissez-faire economics, the idea that the market should be left alone and would eventually fix itself. Their advice? Cut government spending, balance the budget, and wait for things to improve. The problem? It didn't improve. In fact, deflation made everything worse, prices dropped, businesses earned less, and unemployment kept rising. This is where Keynes stepped in with a completely new way of thinking. He argued that in times of crisis, the government should do the opposite of what classical economists recommended. Instead of cutting spending, the government should increase it, funding public projects, putting money in people's pockets, and boosting demand. If people had money to spend, businesses would start hiring again, and the cycle of economic growth could restart. This idea, that the government could actively manage the economy through spending and intervention, was revolutionary. It laid the foundation for Keynesian economics, a school of thought that would dominate economic policy for decades to come. Now, let's break down the core principles of Keynesian economics, what makes it work and why it became so influential. First, government spending. Keynes believed that when private businesses and consumers aren't spending enough to keep the economy going, the government should step in. Public spending on infrastructure, education, and services doesn't just provide immediate jobs, it injects money into the economy, encouraging even more spending. Second, deficit financing. This is where it gets controversial. Keynes argued that during economic downturns, governments should run deficits, essentially, spend more than they collect in taxes. Borrowing money to fund public projects can help kickstart the economy, and once things recover, governments can raise taxes to pay down the debt. Third, counter-cyclical policies. Think of the economy like a roller coaster, there are ups and downs. Keynesian policies suggest spending more during recessions to stimulate growth and cutting back during booms to prevent overheating. It's about managing the business cycle rather than just letting it run wild. And finally, full employment focus. Keynesian economics prioritizes job creation over strict market self-correction. Keynes believed that high unemployment wasn't just a temporary setback, it was a waste of potential that the government had a responsibility to address. Together, these principles formed the backbone of Keynesianism, an economic approach that reshaped government's role in managing economies worldwide. Now, you might be thinking, okay, Keynesian economics sounds great in theory, but does it actually work? Well, let's look at how Keynesian policies have shaped real-world crisis responses. First up, the 2008 financial crisis. When the global economy crashed due to the collapse of the housing market, governments around the world turned to Keynesianism. The US and many other countries rolled out massive stimulus packages, bailouts for banks, infrastructure spending, and unemployment benefits to stop the economy from spiraling into another Great Depression. The idea? Pump money into the system, restore confidence, and keep businesses afloat. Then, we had the COVID-19 economic response. This one was even bigger. In 2020, as lockdowns shut down entire industries, governments unleashed trillions of dollars in relief packages, stimulus checks, unemployment benefits, and small business loans. Keynesian economics was once again at the center of the response, with policymakers arguing that only large-scale government spending could prevent total economic collapse. But not everyone agrees with this approach, which brings us to monetary versus fiscal policy. Keynesians favor fiscal spending, direct government intervention through spending and taxation. Critics, on the other hand, argue that monetary policy, like adjusting interest rates and controlling the money supply, is a better way to manage the economy. This debate plays out every time a financial crisis hits. And of course, there are ongoing debates. Critics warn that constant government spending and debt accumulation could create long-term problems, like inflation or economic bubbles. Keynesianism works well during downturns, but when should government stop spending? That's where the controversy comes in. The big question remains, are Keynesian policies sustainable in the long run, or do they just kick the can down the road? That's what we'll explore next. So, not everyone is a fan of Keynesian economics. In fact, some of the biggest names in economic history have challenged his ideas. Let's look at the key criticisms. First, we have the monetarist critique, championed by economist Milton Friedman. He argued that managing the money supply, essentially controlling how much money is circulating in the economy, is a far better tool than government spending. Instead of throwing money at the problem through stimulus packages, monetarists believe in regulating inflation and letting markets adjust naturally. Then there's supply-side economics, also known as Reaganomics. This school of thought, popularized in the 1980s, argues that the best way to boost the economy isn't through government spending, but by cutting taxes and reducing regulations. The idea is that if businesses and individuals keep more of their money, they'll invest it, create jobs, and drive economic growth from the ground up without government intervention. Another major concern? Debt and inflation. Critics argue that Keynesian policies encourage reckless government spending, leading to massive national debt. And when governments print money to cover these expenses, inflation skyrockets. Sound familiar? This debate is still happening today, especially with rising national debts in countries around the world. And finally, the idea of market self-correction. Classical economists believe that economies naturally go through cycles, booms and busts, and that government intervention just delays the inevitable. They argue that, given time, markets will adjust on their own, without the need for massive public spending. So, is Keynesianism a necessary tool for economic stability, or is it just a short-term fix with long-term consequences? Well, history has given us some interesting case studies to look at. Let's dive into one of the biggest. One of the most famous examples of Keynesian economics in action is the New Deal, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's response to the Great Depression. When FDR took office in 1933, the economy was in shambles. Banks had collapsed, unemployment was at record highs, and confidence in the market was at an all-time low. So, what did FDR do? He went full Keynesian. He launched a massive public works program, creating agencies like the WPA, Works Progress Administration, and TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. These projects built infrastructure, roads, bridges, dams, and most importantly, put millions of people back to work. Another key piece of the puzzle? Government spending boosts. The New Deal pumped money into everything from education to agriculture, aiming to stimulate demand and jumpstart economic recovery. It wasn't just about short-term jobs, it was about restoring confidence in the economy. And then there was the Social Security introduction in 1935. This was a game-changer. For the first time, the US government created a safety net, providing unemployment benefits, retirement income, and financial support for the vulnerable. This wasn't just an economic policy, it redefined the role of government in people's lives. Finally, the lasting economic impact. The New Deal fundamentally transformed how the government interacts with the economy. Keynesianism became the go-to playbook for handling recessions, and its influence can still be seen in policies today. But the story doesn't end there. Keynesianism didn't just reshape the US economy. After World War II, it became the blueprint for rebuilding entire nations. Let's take a look at what happened next. If the New Deal proved that Keynesian economics could help a struggling economy, the Marshall Plan showed how it could rebuild entire nations. After World War II, Europe was in ruins. Cities were bombed out, industries had collapsed, and economies were on the verge of total collapse. The world faced a crucial question: how do you rebuild a continent that's been devastated by war? The answer, at least according to Keynesian principles, was government-led recovery. In 1948, the US launched the Marshall Plan, a massive economic aid package that provided $13 billion, which would be over $100 billion today, to rebuild European economies. But this wasn't just charity, this was strategic Keynesianism in action. The idea was to inject money into infrastructure, industry, and trade, stimulating demand and helping European nations stand on their own feet again. Many countries that received aid adopted Keynesian policies, using government intervention to rebuild roads, factories, and social programs. This led to what's known as the welfare state expansion, programs in countries like the UK, France, and Germany that provided healthcare, unemployment benefits, and housing support, all inspired by Keynesian ideas. And the results? A full-blown economic boom. Post-war Europe saw rapid GDP growth, reduced unemployment, and a surge in industrial recovery. Countries that had been devastated by war were not only rebuilding, but thriving. The Marshall Plan and post-war Keynesian policies helped shape modern Europe, proving that large-scale government investment could not only rescue an economy in crisis, but also lay the foundation for long-term prosperity. But as we've seen, Keynesian economics isn't without its critics. Some argue that while government intervention is useful in the short term, it leads to unsustainable debt and inflation over time. So where does that leave us today? Let's wrap things up with a look at the lasting impact of Keynesianism. So, what's the final verdict on Keynesian economics? Has it been a success, a failure, or something in between? First, there's no denying that Keynesian ideas transformed economic policy. Before Keynes, the idea of government actively managing the economy was almost unheard of. Now, it's the standard response to financial crises. Whether it's the New Deal, the 2008 bailouts, or the COVID-19 stimulus packages, Keynesianism has fundamentally reshaped how governments intervene in markets. Second, Keynesianism has been the go-to strategy for modern financial crises. From the Great Depression to the 2008 recession, to the COVID-19 economic shutdowns, Keynesian policies have played a central role in economic recovery efforts. But that doesn't mean the debate is over. Ongoing policy debates between Keynesians, monetarists, and supply-siders continue to shape global economics. Should governments spend their way out of recessions, or should they focus on reducing debt and letting markets adjust naturally? The battle rages on. And of course, we have future economic challenges. Balancing stimulus, inflation, and debt remains one of the biggest policy struggles today. Keynesianism works well in a crisis, but does long-term reliance on government spending create new problems down the road? That's the big question economists and policymakers still grapple with. At the end of the day, Keynesian economics is not just a theory, it's a real-world strategy that has shaped modern economies. Whether you agree with it or not, its influence is undeniable. And with that, we wrap up today's deep dive. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Truth Behind History. Let me know in the comments, do you think Keynesian economics is the right approach, or do you lean more toward free market policies? And if you love exploring the big moments that shaped history, check out my other videos on economic revolutions, financial crises, and more. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.